Hi again. In this video we're going to learn to do a couple of exercises with our Hypercube, and if you watched my first video and followed along, you made your own copper Hypercube, and this will show you how to do some exercises. What we're going to do is learn how to look at the Hypercube and count 8 cubes within it. We're going to be able to see systematically all the 8 cubes that make it up. And this is similar to, it's one dimension higher than looking at a projection of a cube like this Necker cube and counting the 6 squares that make this up. That's no problem for us because we're familiar with cubes. We look at that and say, oh yeah, I can see a cube there, and we can see the 6 squares that make it up. You have the one on this end, the one on this end, the one on the bottom, the one on the top, and the one in the front and the back. Now the Necker cube, the reason Necker's name is stuck on it, he was interested in the effect of being able to flip the image to one of 2 different images, and that is either having this central point close to you and this one far away, or this point close to you and this one far away. That's not of interest to us now. We're only interested in the projection of a 3-dimensional cube down into 2 dimensions, and then you as a 3-dimensional observer are looking at this 2-dimensional projection of a 3-dimensional object. We're going to hop up 1 dimension for most of those things. We're going to look at the 3-dimensional projection of a 4-dimensional cube, which is comparable to that. But what we can't do is hop up and make you into a 4-dimensional observer. That's what our imagination is going to do. You have to pretend as if you're a 4-dimensional person looking at this thing, just like you are really a 3-dimensional person looking at this, which is 2 dimensions, and you can imagine it. Now we're going to use 2 different methods of counting 8 cubes in our Hypercube. And if you have one of these copper ones that you made, you can follow along. I'm not going to use this one in the video because it's a little too small. I'll use this bigger one that I made. And you don't have one of these, but this might help you if you want to study the video by stopping it. I should point out that each of the 8 cubes is painted in a different color on this. And each cube, each edge of the cube participates in 3 different cubes. So this edge, for example, is colored red, white, and blue. Red, white, and blue. Red, white, and blue. That's the only edge that is red, white, and blue. But it means that this edge is part of the red cube, and that one is the one that goes down here. Now, to identify a cube, I can put my 2 palms on parallel faces, parallel squares, and you can see the cube that's between my hands. So this is the red cube, because every one of these edges in this cube has red paint on it. Then there's the white cube, and this is one square that contains white paint, and here's another one. So between my palms here is the cube that contains all the white paint. So that's number 2. And blue, there's a third one that's blue, and that's this one between my palms. Each one of those edges has blue paint. No other edge has blue paint on it. So that will help. If you could just look at this and say, oh, I see the 8 cubes. There's red, white, blue, yellow, green, and so on. It's not easy. It's a little overwhelming to see that. But I'll show you 2 tricks, 2 methods of looking at a Hypercube and seeing and being able to just count off all 8 cubes. So we'll start. The first method, I want to point something out, that every corner on a Hypercube, every vertex, has 4 edges coming into it. And each of the angles made by any of those four, or by any two of those four, is a right angle. And we can't have four mutually perpendicular right angles in 3 dimensions, and that's why this thing has to be skewed. And some of the angles have to be acute and some have to be obtuse, just because we don't have 4 dimensions. It's exactly the same thing on the cube. You can't draw a 2-dimensional picture of a cube without distorting some of the angles. So you see, these angles are not square either on the page, but in our imagination they are square. We have no trouble looking at this corner and saying, oh yeah, every pair of lines coming into that corner makes a right angle. No problem. This is a right angle, this is a right angle, this is a right angle. Even though if you took your protractor out, you'd see none of them is. So that's the part that our imagination has to play, and we have to try to leap up into 4 dimensions and say that same kind of effect is going on when we try to contemplate a 3-dimensional projection of a 4-dimensional cube. One thing is, the angles are distorted. No problem. We just consider every one of these quadrilaterals to be a square. This is a square, this is a square, just like we do here. So, as I was pointing out, each vertex has 4 lines coming into it because it's a 4-dimensional object, and the 4 lines are the 4 directions that we get with 4 dimensions. Now here's method number 1 for counting all the cubes. If you take those 4 lines coming into a corner, and if you look at your model, there's 2 kinds of corners. There's one where all 4 of them are on the outside. You can touch them all with your palm. And there's some corners that have 1 interior line. You can't touch that with your palm. Can't touch this line with my palm. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these type, and there are, whatever the remainder is, all the rest of them are of this type. So let's take one of this type where you can reach all 4 edges from the outside. You just grab one of the edges and cover it up and pretend it isn't there. So now there's just 3 edges coming out of this point, and 3 edges coming out of one corner determine a square. So I can see these 3 edges on mine all have green paint on them. They don't all have pink, this guy doesn't. And they don't all have blue, because this guy doesn't. So they all have green paint. So there's the green square. Let me put my palms on the squares that are opposite, and you see there's the cube. And if you practice, you can grab one of these edges, cover it up, and immediately see the cube behind it. Now, that's cube number 1. Cubes come in pairs. Just like the squares sort of come in pairs on a 3-dimensional cube. If you look at this square on the front, it has a matching one behind. If you look at this one on the right side, it has a matching one on the left side. Same is true with the cubes in a hypercube. If you take this cube that you can see, and your objective on this exercise is to visualize this cube, then you'll notice that coming out of every single corner of that cube is a line that's parallel to the one you're covering up. From this corner there's a one going, I'll hold it vertically so they're all going straight down. And if you follow any of those lines or all of those lines straight down, lo and behold, they land on the corners of another cube. That's the matching cube. It's exactly congruent to the one you're holding and oriented in the same position. I mean, even the projection is congruent. And so once you see this cube on top, you can easily see the one on the bottom. So they come in pairs. Now, we've covered up 1 out of 4 lines at this corner. So to see more, you just rotate around it and cover up the next one. and lo and behold, you have 3 lines coming out. They make a cube. I'll put it right on top of the figure, with this is the top and this is the bottom, and then directly underneath is the matching cube. So that now we've got 4 cubes. You rotate it and cover up a different line, and here you have the cube defined on top, its matching cube defined on the bottom, and so we're up to 6, and we've covered up 3 out of the 4. We cover up the 4th one, and we get, and then I'll hold it so that that one is on the top. You see here's the square on top, the square on the bottom, and the cube. This one is almost nearly square. And then underneath you see the matching cube. So that's the way you can see all 8 cubes, is just focus on one corner. Imagine that you eliminate each line in turn, rotate through it so you have 4 different imaginations. Each time you see a cube made out of the remaining 3 lines, and opposite the figure you'll see the mating or the matching cube. So that's an exercise you can go through. First, go through just identifying the cube by covering up a line and looking at it and say, ah, I see it. Then cover up another line and say, I see it, there it is. Cover up another line, I see it. And once you get good at that, then you can switch to one of these corners that has an interior line. And you can do the same thing with that. It works just as well, it's just that it's harder to get your hand in there and cover it up. Especially if you are using your copper cube that you made. Okay, that's method number 1 for looking at a hypercube with the object, if you have your projection in copper. Or if you don't, then you can just study any image of this as you stop the video, and then see what I'm talking about. Let me go to the drop down 1 dimension and talk about the equivalent thing we're doing with a 3-dimensional cube. What we're noticing is that each corner has 3 lines coming into it. That's because it's 3-dimensional. And if we eliminate each line in turn, let's say we take this bottom corner, we eliminate this line right here, that leaves 2, and they determine a square, and there's a matching square on the other side of the cube that's parallel to it. If we eliminate this line, the vertical one, then these 2 determine a square, and that's this bottom one, and it has a matching parallel one on top. And if we eliminate this left-hand side, the left-hand line, we have this square determined, and its mating square or matching squares over on the left. So we have 3 different squares that we can determine from each corner, and each one has a matching one on the other side, so that makes up the 6 squares that make a cube. So you can think about what it takes in 3 dimensions as a 3-dimensional viewer to see that, looking at this 2-dimensional picture, and then just imagine that you are a 4-dimensional observer going through the same process, examining this 3-dimensional structure. Now, the next method, method number 2, for looking at this and counting all the squares, is imagine that it's just sitting on a table. Doesn't matter how it's, what face is sitting on the table, it works with any of them. But let's just take, let's suppose it's sitting on a table like this. You have a square that's in contact with the table. And you notice that you have an identical, congruent, and parallel square right on top. So it's like an even-sided die that you just happen to have parallel top and bottom. No matter what you set it on, you're going to get, like here I have a fairly acute square. I have the exact matching one up here. And it works no matter how you set it down. Okay, so let's concentrate on the square on the bottom that's on the table and the square on the top that's parallel to it and congruent to it. Even the projection is congruent. Now you'll notice that inside the hypercube there are two additional squares that are parallel to these two and congruent to them. And if you work through the construction of your own copper hypercube in the first video, that was a fundamental part of how we made the thing. We made it by making 4 congruent parallelograms and then soldering them together in this configuration so that the 4 are all parallel, none of them touching, and as it turns out, that you only need 2 such sets of 4 squares to make one. If we turn it like this, we can see, this is a little hard to visualize, but here we have a very acute square on the bottom, a matching acute square right here, and then inside we have one of those right here, and then one over here. And if you kept track of the ones I pointed out with that last square, you'll find out that accounts for every single edge in the whole hypercube. Okay, now to count squares using that method, you set it on the table in a certain way, in any way you want, and that will determine a square at the bottom, and you have 2 squares in the middle that are parallel to it. Each one identifies a cube. So there's a cube that is made from the square I'm holding on the bottom and the square I'm holding on the top, and a second one, the one on the bottom and this one. So that is 2 more cubes. And then if you take each of those intermediate ones and go on up all the way to the top, you get 2 more cubes. You get the one that's between my palms like this, and the one that's between my palms like this. So just from this one branching up like this, you get 4 cubes, and that's half of them. Now to get the other 4 cubes, well, first let's look at what we're doing with respect to a Necker cube. We're starting with a face that is a square, and we're noticing that it generates or produces 2 cubes. If we drop down 1 dimension, that would mean we'd have to start with not a face or square, but an edge, because that's 1 dimension lower, and it branches to make 2, not cubes, but squares. So think of this edge, and there are 2 squares that touch this edge. It's like a folded piece of paper. You have the one back here, and you have the one up here. So it's like you take a sheet of paper and fold it in half at a right angle. This edge generates 2 squares. This one and this one. And these squares terminate in parallel edges, 2 of them in the middle of the figure, one up here and one here, and that's equivalent to the 2 squares that are parallel and in the middle of our figure and above the base that we are talking about. Now, in our figure, we go from the 2 intermediate squares up to a single square on top, each one generating a cube. Same thing here. We go from this, if we start here and we get these 2 edges, this one and this one. Well, from this one we continue on up and we generate another square on the top and end up with this line over here. And from this one, same deal. We go up and it closes. So we have a bifurcation in the bottom to 2, and then convergence to the top from edge to edges to edge, and that generates our whole, no, it didn't quite generate our whole cube, but it gave us 4. Now in this case we got 4 cubes. No, and in this case we get 4 squares. We're short 2 squares here to make up the 6, and we only got half of them here. We only got 4, and we should have 8. Well, the remaining cubes or squares are generated by, like, let's go back to the Necker cube. If you imagine that we have generated the bottom, this square here, this one, and the 2 top ones, and what we're missing is these 2 end ones. Well, we get those by our original choice of line has 2 endpoints, 2 one-dimensional structures, and those one-dimensional structures, if you take away the single common starting line, there are 2 lines coming out of it. Each one, the 2 together determine a square. And we have 2 endpoints, so you get a square over here determined by this endpoint, and you get a square over here determined by this endpoint. Those are the ends of the box, and that's the additional 2 that give us a total of 6 for the square. So we have to go up 1 dimension. Instead of the 2 endpoints of an edge, we have the 4 edges of a square. Square on the bottom generates a cube on each of its edges. So instead of the endpoints generating squares, we have edges generating cubes. Both are up 1 dimension. But they're both generated by 2 lines coming up off of, here's 2 lines coming out of this point, making this plane, or this square, and 2 lines coming out of this point, making this square. We have 2 planes, or 2 squares coming off of this edge, and 2 of them coming off this edge, and so on. So each edge generates 1 cube. And we have 4 edges, so that's 4 cubes, and that's the 4 missing cubes to make up the 8. So those are the 2 methods for counting cubes. You should get familiar with those, work on it, practice it, and in future videos then we'll put those to use in visualizing more complicated features of 4-dimensional living. Now I think the second method, well, the first method is probably the easiest to do. You can actually see the 8 cubes easier, but you have to manipulate the hypercube. The second method is the easiest to do if your hypercube is just sitting on a table and then you just stare at it without moving you or the hypercube. And when you stare at it, you can easily see the 4 squares that are parallel to the tabletop. This one, this one, this one, and this one. And then so you can see all 4 of the cubes generated by those, and then it doesn't take long to be able to observe the cubes that are generated from each of the edges. And of course they have these top edges as the corresponding edges. So work on that. If you haven't built your hypercube yet, go back and review that video, and there's more to come. Keep tuned. Thanks for watching.